So, just by way of a quick review, just get to where we got here. We're familiar with the Old Testament world. We talked about, this is kind of the world that as they knew it, the world that existed that they knew of. We looked for a little bit at defining regions, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia. What are all these different areas, just so we can kind of hopefully start building a mental map and talk somewhat sensibly about these different areas. And then I think it was last week, oh, by the way, I've got 2 remaining of these maps if anyone wants, with cities on them. They're up here too, but I've had them for like 4 weeks thinking we would talk about cities, and I go slower than I imagine that I will, and we're finally using it. But we've talked about that. Then last week we talked about how cities are an important next step of inquiry in building our mental map. We've got the whole world, and then we start to understand the differences in the regions. But if we're building this mental map to try and understand how things go together, cities become important even very early on, because countries, we should talk more about kingdoms very early. Kingdoms become very malleable. What is Moab? What is Assyria? I mean, they come and they go, and some rise again, some are utterly destroyed. Some persist for centuries or millennia. But the lines are not clear. Even knowing what the lines were at that time isn't terribly clear, but they change over time. So one nice thing about studying cities, as I mentioned last week, is they are fixed points. Like Susa is Susa. If the character of that city changes, but it's always there. We know where it is. So this will help us kind of pin down our mental map to hold things in a little better position so we can understand where things are relative to one another. And as we discussed, I mentioned the ship of Theseus, the idea of things changing over time. These cities do change. The place they are stays the same, but the character changes, the culture changes, the language, the people. Sometimes it stays somewhat consistent, other times it changes drastically over time. But we're not at this point. Later we'll talk about the people who inhabited these cities. Right now we're just talking about the cities themselves. So those are objective reference points, and we can set aside the who was there and what they were like for the moment. The other thing about cities that makes them useful to study, and specifically city-states, as I mentioned. We're calling them city-states back then because they wouldn't have been, states as we think of them today in the United States, or even countries or nations. They would have been individual cities they may band together for trade and things like that, but the cities were independent. They would have a king. A king would be over that city, not over a region or over a whole nation. So we looked last week also at the end at how, just briefly talked about how families that became tribes, just larger groups of related people, how they initially were nomadic, traveling around, finding food and resources for themselves and for their flocks. How they went from that nomadic, large extended family traveling lifestyle to settling down and eventually transitioning into cities. So that gets us to where we ended last week, more or less. Any questions on that much, or things left over from last week, or anything I just said? Does this make sense, or we caught up as far as what cities are and where we're at? All right, so we'll start with a little recap on archaeology. So, and this is kind of interesting, but archaeology is actually a pretty recent pursuit. This is not something that's gone on for very long. We're talking about mid-1800s is when it kind of started. Before that time, ancient cities were seen primarily as fodder for grave robbers. Like, what can we find here? They probably were buried with jewelry or other family belongings. So things that they could melt down and cash in on themselves. Eventually there becomes an antiquities market where people would want to buy these things. So a lot of these things just became plundered well before archaeology becomes a thing. So a lot of times when people would first start going, I think this is so-and-so's burial grounds, this is an old city, and they get there and it's just been scraped or defaced. And then in recent years, we get groups like ISIS who would go in and intentionally destroy historical sites and museums and things. So it's not been a very wide window of time when people have been trying to methodically see what is in the ground and understand what it has to show us. But in mid-1800s is when actual archaeology as we know it today starts to develop. And by modern standards, what they did then looks, vandalism is a strong word, but it was like they know I want to go down and look for evidence of you pick the historical figure or event. And they just go to town until they hit what they think is there, destroying all the layers. We've talked a little bit at different times about how a tell forms, and you get the most, it's an upside down timeline, you get the most recent things on top, and so somebody's just digging down to find what they want. They're just tossing aside everything they find.
Scott?
Yes?
It seems like it was Britain that did a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to the British Museum in London, and I'm like, how did you take all this stuff? Like, did
That's
they?
exactly what they
Did
did.
those other countries like get pretty angry with that?
Oh, yeah.
It must have been.
Oh, and they still are. That has not gone away.
I wonder because it's their stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that
They
gets
never
that gets
have
fun.
to give it
I mean,
back.
are Persian artifacts? Do they belong to Iran? Well, they're related. Some of them. It's a different country.
Yeah.
They're certainly more related than Britain or Chicago or.
I know, because I've been to the Oriental Museum too.
Yeah.
And same thing. I'm like,
Yeah.
how did you get this?
Uh-huh. This is a topic that comes up frequently, and a lot of times things will come, something will surface that's been, that was stolen. I mean, like not even the stealing you're talking about,
Yeah.
stealing,
Right.
but people going and just taking stuff from artifacts and then selling them in the black market. And they change hands over a number of times. And it was just, I can't remember what it was in the news last week, that somebody found this thing. They're going, well, this guy wants to be paid because he found it and turned it over. And they're going, well, but no, it's stolen. And and then you got people fighting. Well, should this be the museum's because it was stolen from a museum's collection, or should it go back to the original country? These things are not easy topics. And
So most of the plundering was in the 1800s?
no, in the middle of 1800s is when what we would recognize as archaeology started.
Okay.
A methodical approach, wearing a monocle and a suit, and whatever, and Indiana Jones, right, with brushes and spades, and trying to be methodical and approaching it. The whole idea of understanding these layers in a tell, that is a relatively recent invention. That's the 1800s, early 1900s as well.
So is most of what's like in our museum, in the Oriental Museum in Chicago, from the 1800s? Or like, how did we get all that?
Discovered or extracted since that period. Or in some cases, something would be found, whether it's on a black market or wherever,
Yeah.
and then a museum would purchase it
Okay,
to put it on display.
okay.
But yeah, the whole idea of ownership and the morality of ownership, I don't know, it's an interesting topic. If you want to read there's a guy that I know, who was a musician, and he's an amateur archaeologist, and an author now that has written several books on he's trying to take a biblical maximalist position. He's a believer, he's a great guy, but he's also trying to make these cool stories, intrigue, whatever. So he's got 3 or 4 books out now. Doug Powell is his name.
What?
Doug Powell. So if you like whodunit kind of stories, they're kind of fun reads, because he's chasing, there's a guy chasing after the thief, whatever. But it's all this archaeology and scripture and stuff woven in that's kind of fun. If you like the things you're talking about. Another thing kind of on this topic, well, 2 things. One Laura made me think of, the whole idea of tells and dating things that came about, and I didn't know I was talking about this, so I had to remember the guy's name. There was a place on the side, basically a ravine or a river cut, where this whole tell had eroded, and this is where a guy is standing there, an archaeologist in the late 1800s, is standing there, and he goes, well, I see different colors, these strata, I see different colors of layers, and he could identify, just naked eye, because it's exposed, he could see different types of pottery and things exposed. And that's when he starts this hypothesis, like, well, wait, that makes sense, that there'd be different, you find the Mycenaean, and then you find Persian, whatever, like these, if this is how this formed, is like his hypothesis, then I should be able to map this out on history. And that is where the whole idea, we talked way at the beginning, about looking at different pottery styles as a way to date, when you find this type of pottery, what era did it come from? That's where that came from, was that initial discovery, and that still holds on today. Something that made that you can't really apply that to, that's, actually I just was watching a video last night, something that got ended just a few days ago. Has anyone ever heard of the Temple Mound Sifting Project? You all have lives and hobbies and things that are normal, so of course you haven't. In the late 90s, so not that long ago, I know it's a long time ago, I understand. But for the rest of us, not that long ago, is it Al-Aqsa? There's a mosque on the Temple Mount that was built around that time. And in order to build it, they just swept off a corner of the Temple Mount. And then to get below it, they exposed the wall. I'll get it wrong. I think it's the southeastern wall, but I'm probably wrong. But they exposed one of the whole walls, it's a retaining wall holding up the Temple Mount. And once you pull it back, and you can look it up and see these pictures of dozers moving, like right now, an archaeologist can't go in there with a spoon and move things around, but there's guys with giant earth movers, Muslims, moving this dirt to get to this wall. Because they wanted, I'm not sure exactly what their purpose for clearing this away was. It was in order to build the mosque. But they clear away, this wall that's there has all these arches in it. And you can see little portions of some of them where it's exposed, but for the most part they're all buried. Well, when they expose this, there's a couple of archaeologists in that area who see this and go, wait, we're not allowed to dig there. Like all the stuff that's here, they took overnight, during the night, they took 100 truckloads, big trucks, 100 loads, and just dumped it. And these guys had to do some homework and trace that they dumped it in the Kidron Valley. It got moved around a few times, but they started what they called the Temple Mound Sifting Project. And you can Google it, there's some fun pictures and history there. But for them, they had a whole different challenge. Like they've taken this, what should have been a handy tell, essentially, the strata to be able to sort through. They didn't have that anymore because a shovel went in and overturned it all. And so now they go, okay, here's a Roman era coin, and here's this. So they're just looking at it for what artifacts can we find. And they're mainly looking for proof of David and things like that, which is still contested by some people. But it's not in neat layers, but it's fascinating. 100 truckloads, it's a lot of stuff. In the last few days, because of the war and economy and other stuff, they just put a pause on it. They've been going for, 20 years. And they're hoping that they can pick it back up again. But rabbit trail that popped in my head, so now you know. Anyway, the reason we have these tells, and tell, I'm pretty sure just means hill or mound. And actually, let me see if it's on here or not. Yeah, here you'll see some famous ones, more well-known. Tel Shiloh, right here. This is where Shiloh was, where the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle was for a few hundred years. Bethel, Betin, Ai, that was conquered by during the conquest. It's called Et Tel is the name of that dig. El Jib, these Tel Bet Shemesh. Sometimes they have the name of the city they presume or know that it is in it. Sometimes the name means something else, and later they discover what city they think it is. So, but if you see Tel, it just means they found a hill. If you see Kerbet, and there's one right here, Kerbet Qumran. Anybody ever heard of Qumran? That's one that you gotta have heard of, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls are found there. It's called a Kerbet and not a Tel. A Tel is a hill that they excavate through to discover things. So it's basically a garbage pile. It's old civilizations, but they don't leave their good stuff. They leave broken pottery or whatever for the most part. So you're just digging through what they have. Kerbet means ruins. So if you see a Kerbet, that's another name that could be used for studying one of these places. That just means ruins. It's usually exposed ruins. They don't have to dig. So Kerbet Qumran means they just walked in there, and there's all these clay pots there. And there's things to discover. They didn't have to dig and try and figure out what was what. It was a stash of documents that had been left there. Not that this has anything to do with a whole lot, but if you see tell or Kerbet, that's what those mean.
Scott,
Yes?
so when we say dig and walk into, you know, you picture hundreds, thousands of years or whatever, that everything gets covered up with sand and all
Yeah.
that. And so there's some areas that it gets covered, other areas it remains exposed and doesn't get covered up.
Good
Is
question.
it because of the terrain?
No, it's because of man. So what's generally happening, somebody picks a spot, let's take Cairo, you know, any of these Egyptian cities, Cairo or Memphis, down here, you can see why they pick the land they pick, right? You see Susa, Nineveh, all these places, they're built near water or whatever, on a trade route. If somebody built, or it's building walls around a spring perhaps, so they've got a water source that they can control, whatever made that location a useful place to build a city didn't go away. Like its proximity to a river or to a trade route or whatever, that didn't change just because somebody came in and destroyed the town or somebody else took it over or they all died or whatever. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So when that happens, either later generations or a whole new culture comes in and that area is just as desirable as it used to be for the same reasons it was before. And even more so because they come in, it's not built like we build today. They're building in stone, in the land of stone, out of stone. So if they come in and they want to build, they go, somebody's already cleared it. And that's a big pain to clear a stone site to build a city. They've got one that's already cleared and leveled, and there's already foundations there. So let's just pick up and take these walls that are already there and rebuild them, or just build new walls in different directions on top, because it's all compacted, it's all level, it's all cleared. Like, it's where we want to be for all the same reasons, and a whole lot of work has already been done. So they'll come in and build it, and when they get sent away, or it gets burned, or it gets crashed over to rubble or whatever, it all, as it collapses, you know, people don't come back and just, let's go pick up all the walls and things. It just stays there, or is burned and everybody's dead, whatever. And then somebody else comes back and finds this and let's use it again. So that's how you get the layer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, and now, to your question, some of the layers are natural, you know, depending how long it's sat vacant, and we'll see some of that in a minute, where you can see sand just blows over it. But the fact that there's a hill there that people can still see, they'll, you know, archaeologists will go, that is not natural to see a hill like that in a land that's blown around by sand. There's something there. Now, comparing it to the Bible, comparing it to trade routes, other things we know, is this in a place that seems like it's something worth investigating? Well, that's how they decide which ones they're going to hit, and that's how you can see the ones that have been discovered. Now, and I mean, look at where they are. These are the places that people have started digs because there's a reason to go there, and they find something that makes it look like that. And if you look, 1900s and 1950s, that's when a whole lot of this started, looking for these tells and digging them. Does that help with your question? Any other questions? So, that covers all that I want to say about archaeology. Just a refresher on how we find these sites. And again, I'm using we in a way that benefits me and us. I had nothing to do with any of this, but this is how archaeology and all these different pursuits have found these places and know where to look, and know how to understand what they find.
Scott,
Yes, Fred?
how do they determine who, when they find things, how do they determine who it belongs to? What country or what city or what?
It's a great question. And when you ever watch documentaries when people go dredging and somebody pulls up something off the Titanic?
Yeah.
Is it the country it went out from? Is it the company that built the ship? Is it the guy who chartered that particular?
Yeah.
Is it who owns the bottomlands where it's found? It's kind of similar to that. When things get that old, it's not like there's somebody walking around going, "That's my book," Sometimes there are people with what seem like a much stronger claim than others. These guys, their argument, the British archaeologists that Laura mentioned, they're going to go over there and they're going to say, wait a minute, you guys have left this sitting here for thousands of years and nobody's touched it. And I come over here and find this, and all of a sudden, that's yours. Like my school is underwriting my salary, and all these other people come over here, all this equipment, and we do all this. Seems like they have some kind of claim on it, but how much? Not, I'm glad I'm not involved in those decisions. But those are the different factors that come up that make it a fascinating question.
I know in ships, when they find a ship and it's got some gold on it,
Yeah.
they now have laws.
Uh-huh.
You know, the country has laws that,
Yep.
you know, this is ours,
Yeah.
so.
Todd.
I was just gonna say, now today, in Israel and Egypt and places like Jordan, if they're antiquities authorities.
Right.
You have to license to dig.
Correct.
So, you know, big things they would keep, I'm sure, but
Yep.
if the researchers probably get to take some back.
Yeah. There's more that goes into it because they got to get permit to go there. And then sure they discuss all that, well, what's going to be found, and who gets credit and all that kind of thing. And some places where it's less defined, or sometimes it might be like if you're in Turkey, which is generally friendly if you're looking for Ark and things like that. Well, it's over kind of near some unfriendly people. So even though you're in a place that you can be and you get permission to be, it's not a place generally people want to go right now because bad things can happen. And not just going there, you don't just get dropped off on, Mount Judy or Mount Ararat to study. You have to fly in somewhere else and then get there. And that's not easy. I mean, it hasn't been easy for a long time, but the war has not made it any easier.
The country of Turkey, they don't allow people to go up there, do they?
Oh, I'm not sure what goes into it, but one of the archaeologists that I know, that I talk to pretty regularly, he goes up there 3-4 times a year.
Really?
Mhm. Yeah.
So, before we leave archaeology, one of the things that I'm interested in hearing what your take is what's going on with the search for the Ark of the Covenant? Is there is there things, we think it's here, or we're looking for it here, or we
Right.
think it's in some basement in Germany, or?
Right.
What?
Yeah. There are a lot of theories, and that's one I haven't read in a long time. I didn't anticipate that one today. It's a great question, though. I thought you were going to say the other Ark, which is a little easier. Ark of the Covenant, I have, to me, what seems most persuasive is either it was destroyed as part of the plunder, as when the city, not plunder, but as the city's being taken, that it was just destroyed. If it wasn't, and this is just me speculating, I have no idea. In the Bible, the Ark is very central to the story, and then you just don't hear about it for a long time. And there is a verse that says something about the Ark will not be heard from again, or something like that. I can't remember what the verse is, but something like, what are you talking about? But so it's just not spoken of a whole lot. So I think given that, and given Jewish traditions, what makes most sense is either it was destroyed outright, or when they discovered it, they stripped it's covered with gold and whatever else, that they stripped whatever was valuable off of it. Those seem likely. Another possibility that might be likely, if you like intrigue and want to hold out for a cool story one day, there are caverns underneath the Temple Mount. And actually one of Doug Powell's books talks about this. So you get to, it's fiction that's based on reality. And so he's uncovering all these facts about who has gone down there, what's true, and whatever. There are caverns down there, known because of you get Temple Mount, you've got multiple authorities involved, and not many people get to touch anything. But another possibility is that as the city is being invaded, that they went and hid it there, and essentially where they believe it is directly under where it had been. That there is, some people think that there's this big room, they've reported having seen it, a natural room, a natural cavern that has other tunnels leading off of it, that is directly under, but quite a ways under the Temple Mount. And that the Ark of the Covenant was put there for Indiana Jones or whatever, for the future. And that, it's plausible. And no one could say yes or no, because nobody's been there to be able to do those kind of searches in a long, long time. So it's an interesting possibility. So, I'm open to all kinds of different things, but that's one thing, the Bible just doesn't say much at all. And outside of the Bible, nobody talks about it, so.
Right. there's no book or anything like that that's, the search for the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, there probably are, just not that I'm aware of that I've read.
Okay.
But, Doug's, this is turning into a Doug plug here. I can't remember which of his books is on that topic. It's somebody trying to find the Ark. Of course, the main story is fiction, but everything else he puts into it is all true. So one neat thing about that, it's kind of funny to have a footnoted fictional book. But he says, if you're interested in finding out about this one dig I talked about, this one explorer that claims to have seen such and such, he tells you all the sources he went to. So if you're interested in that, then you could look at that.
Doug
But,
what?
what's that?
Doug what?
Doug Powell is,
Powell.
yeah. A fiction book, but it's a lot of fun. Any other questions before I mention an actual city?
Temple Mount is a holy spot for the Muslims, right?
Yeah,
And are they in control of that?
it's very complicated.
Yeah.
It's in Israel,
Yeah.
but the Temple Mount is, the Jordanian police are the ones who are walking the site. And there's a third group, and I can't remember their name, I don't know. It's a third group that if you want to go there and take video, if you're not just a regular tourist or somebody going to worship, if you want to just go up there for something unusual, you have to get permission from this other group, and they're the ones that manage the scheduling and everything. So there's 3 major authorities, and there's a whole lot of other people who'd be upset if you did something there that don't have any official say. So it's a rat's nest. A lot of people have a lot invested there. Okay, so and remember I mentioned last week when we talk about cities, we're going to talk about it's a place with specialization where people can have farmers, leather workers, iron workers, whatever. So people can specialize. They don't have to do everything. It's peaceful enough they can specialize on their own thing while somebody else handles security. Somebody else handles getting food because they had specialized in those things. They have not only cultural structure like specialization, but they also have physical structure. So you're going to see homes. You're going to see a place of worship. You're going to see cisterns and storehouses for food. You're going to see a marketplace, all those kind of things. And because of all of this, and they're sitting there and not moving around like they used to, they're going to have a wall. So these and more are the things that are going to define a city. So when I talk about, you may have heard of other older digs, Ein Gazal, Chabahoyik, Göbekli Tepe. There's a whole lot of places out there that are equal to or maybe older than the ones I'm going to say. The reason I'm not saying them now is because I'm talking about cities. Okay, Göbekli Tepe was not a city. Chabahoyik is not a city. Those are other different areas, up primarily in Turkey. But we talk about cities. So here I've got this date. You can see I have is Exodus, and you can see a lot of cities there. I'm going to rewind here, and you'll see fewer cities. It's going to flash for a minute. It'll settle down a minute.
So Scott?
Yes.
So that when the Bible says the town of Bethlehem, so then that means Bethlehem is not a city. Is that what that means when it says?
Oh, I don't mean, well,
I mean, does that mean it's smaller than?
yeah, I mean,
former?
similar to us. When you say a town or a village, then they're probably going to mean similar things.
Right, okay.
And I don't think Bethlehem did have any sort of wall. So they would be, they are much, much later than the cities we're going to be talking about. Remember, I'm talking about city-states. These cities would have had kings.
Okay.
There's a time when there were no real allegiances of empires and things like that being built. So people were all insular, little communities were protected. Now, Bethlehem, I'm not sure the date of that. I'm only talking about things that are well before 2500 BC. Because after that, you see an explosion of cities. They're everywhere. Because of, like I mentioned last week, the Tower of Babel and things like that. Did that stop again?
No, it's just honestly not.
Oh, so, yeah, so the cities I'm going to be mentioning are going to be the ones that, like I said, big. Tens of thousands of people. Big wall, stuff like that. There are other, Bethlehem's, probably lots of other smaller towns that aren't even on the radar, not on my radar, that I'm not mentioning. And the other thing is, we're talking about things that are going to be names that most of them you're going to know. Historians are going to know. So one of the most ancient known cities is Jericho. And I've mentioned before, we talked about this being something of a land bridge to get between Africa, Asia, Europe, because of not only the desert, but also because I mentioned the Jordan Rift Valley, which is this here. And you can kind of see the Jordan comes from Galilee down to the Dead Sea and then kind of peters out. Here's your Jordan River. And it's not super easy to see here. I'll zoom in a minute. When you talk about plate tectonics, how the earth moves, you've got abduction and subduction, all this. You got plates going under and over each other, and that's what causes mountains and things like that. There's another thing called a rift, and I'm saying things as if I know what I'm talking about. This is now, I'm now empty of all knowledge I have on this topic. A rift is when, imagine you take dough, because that's all I can think of, because we have it all over our house. Dough. Play-Doh, whatever. When you have something, don't think of things doing this kind of deal. That's one way that big mountain ranges are formed. Another thing will happen is if you take dough, Play-Doh, whatever, and you pull it apart, as it thins, it gets lower in the middle. You know what I'm saying? Well, that's what thin is. So, but it stays bigger on the sides. That in whatever geology, let's say, is called a rift. So this Rift Valley is because there's a plate or whatever here and one here, and they're pulling apart, forming this valley. That makes sort of sense? So if I zoom in here, you'll see this is another reason this becomes what I'm calling a land bridge, essentially. You've got over here, this was Moab and whatever at one point, some of the tribes of Israel over here eventually. But look at all these hills. And then it comes down into the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley, and there's Galilee way up there, and then it comes back up again. Up in here, this is En-Gedi, where David hid from Saul. But these mountains were used for different things in the side of this valley. My reason for mentioning this is if you're going across somewhere, or you want to get from one place to another, you don't want to go down through all that and then find a way across the river and then go all the way back up again. So you're going to try and get on the west side of Galilee and follow it down. So this is why we got these trade routes here and why we've got so much traffic and why Israel is in the news all the time back then. Why they're in conflict with all these people. Because friend and foe and everybody who wants to go anywhere is going through their neighborhood. Does that make sense? Because of this Jordan Rift Valley. All that to say, Jericho is a town if I can make this work, in the Jordan Rift Valley. Here it gets quite wide, but if we come down in here, interesting to see, get down eye level here, and check out those mountains on the side there. So they're pretty well protected to the west, Jericho is. But Jericho ends up being, we can actually see right here, is, and it's not super high res or anything, but this is the ruins of Jericho that exist there today. Not just out in the middle of the desert somewhere. You're on your way to work, you're driving past it. They just built up all around it, but they preserve this, and still people study it. That's Jericho. It was, if you zoom back out here again, you got a lot of mountains to the west, and then desert to the east. It's an oasis, even way, way, way back. That is the reason the city was formed. It had freshwater spring, had a fortress. Look it up. There's one of the world's, I think the world's oldest architectural structure is a spiral tower, spiral stairs inside of it. Only a portion of it remains, but there's this round building with spiral stairs in it, and it's thousands and thousands of years old. It's been there for a long, long time. Kind of a frontier between a couple of different wilderness areas. That is Jericho. And I'm just giving you kind of a really quick picture at a lot of these and seeing where they are. Just because it lasted so long, anybody familiar with the area would have known about Jericho, and it's going to be part of the story. Even if we're not talking about Jericho itself, describing things by their proximity to Jericho will make a lot of sense as we go. If we go way over northeast, the next And I'm going generally from the oldest that we know, as far as we can tell, the oldest to more recent. So the next one is Nineveh. So we've got the Euphrates down here, and up here is the Tigris. Nineveh is on the Tigris, and similar to Jericho, they're at the base of these foothills. So mountains. There's Mount Judy too, which is kind of interesting to think about. One of the oldest towns, and I don't favor this view, but this is what a lot of people think is the Ararat of the Bible. There's another mountain just a little ways north called Greater Ararat that probably makes sense, but it's kind of interesting how close Ararat, these two Ararat, these two sites in the mountains of Urartu, or Ararat, are close to, how close they are to one of the world's oldest cities. Interesting that they would settle close to that. Maybe they were coming down from there. Anyway, Nineveh is way across the other side of the Levant. They're on the far edge of Mesopotamia. This one is probably worth looking in as well. You come in here again, a lot of development, and then you get in here like, oh, look at that. And this, if you get in Google Earth or things like that, go looking for pictures online. There's a lot of stuff to see. It's pretty neat. On the Tigris River, so this is why they are there for trade and for freshwater. It starts as a city, eventually becomes a legendary capital. And this one went through a number of times that it was nearly annihilated by different empires taking over. Eventually it was. Assyria was destroyed. It was the capital of Assyria. And then when Assyria was conquered, so was Nineveh. But that's way in the future from the early times we're talking about. And Nineveh, back from the time, and this is interesting too, when you read the prophets, when they are declaring what is going to happen in judgment because of what Nineveh does, Assyria does, there's prophecies of what will happen to this land, not just the people, but the land. It's going to be desolate, and it'll only be inhabited by jackals and whatever, that kind of language. And that's what's there now. That's all that's there. Since its destruction, all this other stuff has happened, but this patch of land here, nothing has happened there. It is sad, as was predicted. And here's another fun one. We're going to go down the Tigris quite a ways, or it gets close to the Euphrates, and jump over the Euphrates to a town called Eridu that I mentioned last week. And I mentioned this too, I've mentioned this before. So now this is Persian Gulf. Hasn't always looked this way. It's gone up and down, and it may well have not existed. There's theories that the Garden of Eden was down in here somewhere, and it's all underwater now. There's other theories where Eden might have been. Doesn't really matter, except to say this is a low area. That's why there's water there. And the water, way back when, so let's say Abraham's time, would have been higher because, he's up here. He was from Ur. And, yeah, actually that's Ur. So he's from up here, but these were near this water, so this would have been up higher. Anyway, all this area here, it's not like this dry, even though it's all same tan color. It's not like it's all beach sand right up to here, and they got a nice line. This is all quite marshy. They're going around in boats, through reeds and stuff. It's not terribly well defined. Eridu, it's right here. You see this diamond road around it, but if you go into, there we go, this spot here, and this goes to what Fred was talking about. Eridu, this here is the site I mentioned last week as being formerly you can't see much now, but back when it was uncovered, a long time ago, this is the ziggurat that got abandoned. And the temple structure was adjacent to it, and there's drawings of what the archaeologists found. Since then, they haven't kept up on the, it's old and it's not in great shape. Mm-hmm. They haven't kept up on studies, or on the dig there. Mm-hmm. So once it gets abandoned, the sand starts blowing over it again. So you combine sand blowing over it, a ruins that was already in really tough shape, not terribly well defined, and this here is all marshy. So it's just not, if you dig, the holes are going to fill up with water. It's just a tough place to study. But this is Eridu that I think was most likely the site of the Tower of Babel. Maybe not, but the Tower of Babel, well, the destruction of Eridu dates back to about 3200 BC. So, it's where the Euphrates empties into the Persian Gulf. There are early kings lists. I think I've mentioned them before. Sumerian king lists. The Egyptians had them. They would keep lists of this guy was king, then this guy was king, and they'll start out. He was king for 26,000 years. Was he? They're interesting numbers, and there's theories about why they use the numbers they do. But these are one of the first things we have recorded after, like I mentioned before, the earliest language is, for doing trade, and then after that it's for laws, but also very quickly it's about king lists, keeping track of who's been around and who's in charge so they can keep track of dynasties. Like I get to be in charge because look, my name goes back. I mentioned that to say one of the oldest kings lists we have is from Eridu, found in Eridu, and Eridu and Uruk, they kind of go together. The way I understand it, the way that people have looked into it, where's Uruk? There it is. That Eridu and Uruk were kind of sister cities. This was kind of like headquarters of commerce, trade, whatever. And this was more a religious capital. That's why you get the ziggurat. There is a ziggurat, the ziggurat Ur. I don't think here. But Ur came around a bit later. But these two were kind of sister cities in a way, and this would be a site of religious pilgrimage for some time. They both were destroyed around the time I mentioned of the late Uruk expansion, 3200 BC, which I was mentioning all the things that go together that we'll look at later. But it's an interesting study to see these cities that were probably the earliest, among the earliest, to qualify as a city. I mean, massive population, an actual king, all these kinds of things. And in the king lists, they actually state, we are the first city. And it says so-and-so is the first king they list of their city. And it says, by the way, he is the first king that has ever been. So they say the idea of kings began in Eridu. Who knows whether it did, but it's interesting. This city dates back a long time. Let's see. Byblos, we're just jumping around, but they're kind of in time order, and they kind of make sense where they are. We've been on rivers. Somebody say something? Now we're going to jump over here. So just for reference, I don't have this one labeled, but here Israel has been different places in this area. North of it, we get Lebanon in the Bible, and still today. And you hear a lot about Tyre and Sidon. There's also a city here that doesn't get mentioned quite as much. It's older, called Byblos, right there. Byblos it's on the coast, the Levantine coast. It was one of the earliest port cities, and this would be where papyrus was a big export from Byblos. Papyrus, spices came through there. Another big thing was cedar. They're cedar trees. The cedars of Lebanon. If somebody wants the cedars of Lebanon, it's the easiest way is by boat for the most part. So they're shipping them out of Byblos, and that they have been continually inhabited they think up to 5000 BC. Whatever, a long time. This is the one thing that sets these guys apart compared to all the others is continual inhabitation, where other places come and gone or sat vacant for some time and then get taken over again. Byblos is one of the first ones that we see that has been. It's a port city, so it makes sense that it's going to keep on going, but it's been inhabited the whole time. Lots of dynasties rule over them over the years as they take over, but the city remains. Damascus is another one, just inland from Byblos. Byblos is here. There's Damascus. Damascus we're pretty familiar with. That is in the center of the Levant on a mountain plateau, and they've got, it's otherwise prone to drought in that area, but they're in an oasis valley. So that's why, similar to Jericho, they're in a spot where if you're in the neighborhood and you need a place to stop, or you need a place to conquer, or whatever, it made Damascus very attractive. And it probably dates back about the same as Byblos and maybe even Jericho, and has been continually inhabited, occupied for quite a long time. And they interestingly kept a lot of independence through all these different changing empires. They kept their language and culture in ways that other places didn't. But that could be just because of how remote they were to some of the others. Any questions, feel free to interrupt.
So a lot of those geographic places where they were an oasis thousands of years ago are still an oasis now. Like
Some of them are, yeah. Or there would be a water source, like a spring or something down deep that they can still access. So you dig down, and like the wells that Abraham or Jacob dug are still, there are still wells there that are incredibly old, that by tradition are those same wells. So yeah, there's still water in many of these. Jerusalem is one you've probably heard of. Starts out as Salem. You hear Melchizedek, king of Salem, mentioned in Abraham's time. Later, then you know the in-between city name of Salem. Jebus is what it becomes known as for a while, because it is the headquarters of the Jebusites, who you read living among the people of Jerusalem when David first conquers it. So Salem, Jebus, and Jerusalem, same city, but that's a good example of an area that different people take control of. It gets different names. Same location, they keep on building on top of things, but it still remains a city. That one, a lot of times, priestly classes and transient tribes. Remember all the things that happened there. Abraham taking Isaac to sacrifice him. It's just a number of things that happened over the years that made it an important site to a lot of different people. So it's always been that kind of a place. Interesting though, it doesn't really have any natural resources right there. There's not, and there are springs and things like that, but nothing that sets it apart like some of these others where it's an oasis or a port or something like that. But it has persisted. Over on the Iranian plateau, bounce around here, is Susa. So here, again, kind of like Nineveh, at the foothills of the Zagros Mountains there, inhabited about the same as the others, somewhere around 4000 BC. Susa evolves into a chief political and cultural center, and eventually, they start out as a city-state, eventually gets subsumed into other cultures that take it over, becomes a capital of different places. It remains a metropolis throughout all this. Again, you see all this green, and it would have been different back then, probably even more lush, but come down in here and look at this area that there's just nothing going on, and you zoom in and see different things like, that's pretty organized. That is ancient Susa. Sidon, back where we just were, over by Byblos, similar kind of deal. So Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, you'll see them back then. It could be in reference to Lebanon or Phoenicia. These are Phoenician port towns. It wasn't really a country as much as an area. They called them Phoenician. Up here, again, this is another maritime city-state, thriving port. Sometimes dominated by different inland empires like others were. They also shipped the trees, the cedars. There's other things like dyes, oils, wines, and other crafts that went from here throughout the Mediterranean. The Sidonian artists they pioneered glass technology early on. So glass beads started coming out of there, as well as they perfected the purple dye. When you first see purple start coming out as a symbol of richness, opulence, whatever, a lot of that comes out of Sidon. And they had enough going on that they were active up until about the 5th century BC. So they went quite some time. I mentioned this before. We're not going by location, we're going by time. So a little bit later than these other ones, we see over near Uruk and Eridu where we just were. This is in the similar how we got the delta of the Nile that goes north and empties into the Mediterranean. The Persian Gulf, or the Tigris and Euphrates, flow the other direction. They flow south to the Persian Gulf. So here we've got a delta down here at the north end of the Persian Gulf. So everything is flowing down into the Persian Gulf here, and this is where is. And because of all this, just like in northern Egypt, because of all this silt washing down, it's a very rich area for growing things, whatever. So develops here, and this is where Abraham's from. This dates back to 4000 BC, capital of early southern Mesopotamian rulers. They'll come up a lot early on because they were a big deal. When Abraham was there, this was New York City. This is the big hopping area of the time. Lots of people, but also there are people that want to trade all throughout this area along the Euphrates. They can, and any people that want to go farther out, India or wherever, they can go out through the Persian Gulf. So there's a lot going on in I mentioned last week, I think, or at some point, this is where they pioneered four-wheeled vehicles, the first that we've seen four-wheeled vehicles anywhere, wagons and things. And this is where we have the earliest known law codes that we have, recorded law codes, come from Let's mention one more over here, and then wrap her up for today. So Memphis, at the top of the delta, the southern end of the delta, when it starts to spread out there, is Memphis, and this is on the western end of the known world. This is a capital that was established around 3100 BC. We'll talk later about a guy named Narmer, the first known pharaoh of Egypt, who came about 100 years after the temple at Eridu that I mentioned was destroyed. So interestingly, the history of Egypt begins within 100 years of this ziggurat that sure sounds like the Tower of Babel being destroyed. All of a sudden we have a place called Egypt, as far as kings and dynasties. There may have been people around there, but he comes in and unites the people into a kingdom. And he unites the upper and lower, old and middle kingdom. He controls the Nile Valley, from Memphis the Nile Valley is controlled, and major trade routes. I mean, if you're going down the Nile, and the Egyptians had kind of a backwards to our point of view, they think the Nile goes this way, so south to them is how everything is oriented, because that's where everything comes from the river. So whether things went up the Nile or out into the Mediterranean, Memphis was another great place to be located, to be a metropolis, the kind of trade and everything else they had. And then, not far from here, you see, up in here, you can't see it on this very well, but up in here is where all of the pyramids would be built that you've heard of. They're around 2500 BC, so about 600 years after Memphis is founded. I will stop here unless there's any questions, comments, thoughts about some cities we've looked at. There's just a couple more to look at next week.
So did somebody just decide to name Memphis, Tennessee after that Memphis?
Oh yeah,
Is that right?
absolutely, yep. There's a whole lot of things in the U.S. that are named after things over here.
Things.
Yeah, Goshen, Indiana,
Yeah.
I don't think that's a coincidence,
Right.
a lot of things like that. Yeah.
You said the Egyptians had the flipped north-south perspective. I also heard that east was also kind of ancient north. Is that the case at this time frame, or
The East was what now?
their version of north?
I don't know about them. Certainly in the earliest part of the Old Testament, and as you develop, that when you start to see, this is how they know when they're finding Israelite cultures, by the temple being, or tabernacle, how is the tabernacle situated, how are encampments placed, because of the orientation of Eden, and there it says, not the Messiah, but things precursors to the Messiah, when that becomes an interesting thing in Scripture. I'm not aware of Egypt, about Egypt, East. That it may well be. I don't know.
Just kind of, from my understanding, the idea of north being top of the map comes
Yeah.
from ocean exploration.
Oh, I gotcha.
Having to explore with the North Star.
Yeah.
So that's,
Oh, that's a good thought.
everyone else did Rising of the Sun.
Yeah. There's a lot of truth to that, and I don't know how much they're making maps like we think of them. But that is a good point to keep in mind. North is arbitrary. I mean, We think of it like maps have to be this way. There's no reason to do that, except we just chose that as a convention. And I'm not saying it's wrong, it's how it is. So if somebody else does it another way, it's because they had a reason that things made sense to orient it a certain way. We'll stop there. Thank you, Lord, for even showing your hand in boring things like geography that become less boring when we see the history of you working throughout time to accomplish your plan. Not haphazardly, but you have guided everything that has happened, the people, the places, the cultures, all the way up until the point of the Messiah, your Son. And we thank you for that. We thank you that we still, even this much in the future, thousands of years ahead, we can look back on that and appreciate the benefits that are given to us that they could only dream of. We thank you for this opportunity. We thank you that through him we are all brought together. And we thank you for this time to learn of you, to worship you, and to do so together as a body. Thank you for all of this. In Jesus' name, amen.